Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wen-Chi Yu. Similar to Taiwan's TSMC for decades, ASML, headquartered in the Netherlands, has been one of the world's leading semiconductor equipment manufacturers. ASML quietly enjoyed its monopoly in photolithography, which is a critical process used in the manufacturing of integrated circuits. However, US-China technology competition is thrusting ASML into a geopolitical realignment. So how does ASML navigate business and politics? Today's guest is Mark Hiddink, a journalist with the Dutch newspaper NRC and author of a new book, Focus, The ASML Way, which gives us an unprecedented inside look into the decades of global semiconductor supply chain and ASML's forced and swift response to business and geopolitical challenges. Welcome, Mark.
Hi. Well, thanks for having me, Wen-Chi.
Well, the rise of ASML is a tale of the reorientation of the global semiconductor industry over almost 4 decades. Can you briefly share why you say ASML's lithography is the heartbeat of this industry?
Well, I really like the phrasing "heartbeat" because, you could compare ASML's machines, the lithography machines, to giant copiers that are capable of printing these very fine lines of a semiconductor in a rapid pace on a huge scale. So, for example, TSMC's fabs are filled with lithography machines, and you could compare them to the oven in a bakery. So it's like the central tool in this chip factory. It also has other tools, but the lithography really defines how fine-grained the structures are. And if you look at, for example, your phrasing of the word, use of the word heartbeat, every time...
It's your book used that word heartbeat, which I find, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, excellent. So the fact that the heartbeat improves every time there's a new generation of lithography, the chip makers can step up their game and create even more cost-effective chips, which kind of propels Moore's law. And so lithography is the main tool. And if you look at ASML, they have about 90% of market share in the whole lithography market. And the number of chips that are produced worldwide each year, they account for, well, about 1 trillion plus chips, and 90% of them is manufactured by ASML's machines.
Yeah. I mean, this is fascinating. Do you have a sense how many lithography machines that TSMC may have that is from ASML?
I guess that's about 100%.
100%. Okay.
Yeah, and if you look at the worldwide footprint of ASML, there are about 5,000 lithography machines out in the field, and some of them are over 2 decades old, and they're still running. So it's a huge footprint, and which is mainly ASML. But of course, there are competitors like Nikon, like Canon, and of course,
they don't seem to be that competitive anymore, which is also quite interesting in your book. I want to move on to sort of the symbiotic relationship between government and semiconductor companies. Well, because ASML's earlier days also relied on the Dutch governments and EU subsidies, and similar to TSMC's earlier days in Taiwan, and then today in the US, which, you know, we've seen unprecedented government subsidies and incentives through the CHIPS Act. And of course, in China, the government has provided the world's largest amount of subsidies to try to accelerate China's independence in this industry. So do you think government subsidy or government's role is almost like the prerequisite for the semiconductor industry's very existence?
Well, I think it's a very important ingredient, especially when it comes to, well, just take your only 2 examples. So like the early start of ASML 4 decades ago, back in '84, and what China's trying to achieve in China mainland, building its own equipment tools as well. So especially in this first this initial startup phase, you really need help from the government to get you through all the research and innovation expenses that are needed for these very complex tools. And ASML back in the day was depending, well, I think half of their research funds were coming from Brussels, from the EU, or from The Hague, where the government of the Netherlands resides. So they were really depending on the government. And you see the same thing happening, for example, now in China, where there's a lot of subsidies flowing into these equipment manufacturers that are desperate to, discover and innovate their own technology, because they're being restricted by export controls. And especially in the initial phase, when there's not yet this economical viability of huge scale, you need their government.
So the reason why I ask this question is obviously government's strategic decision whether they want their country to have some type of leadership in semiconductor matters hugely, and therefore government's say or approval or demands of semiconductor businesses become also quite interesting, especially over the last few years, what we have seen, right? And I want to quote in your book when ASML CEO around the year of 2000 literally said, no one puts pressure on the US. As soon as they, meaning the US, said it's a matter of national security, it's game over, right? He was describing a roadblock to ASML's takeover of a company, which is called Silicon Valley Group, a US-based company that needed US government approval on the grounds of national security. That was like 25 years ago, 24. And today, it has become even more evident in the semiconductor line of business that US government wields enormous power. So how does a company like ASML navigate capitals of Washington, D.C., The Hague, Brussels, and its own business interests?
Okay. I think the example you describe, let's just zoom in on the fact that around the turn of the millennium, so it was around 2000 when ASML tried to acquire SVG, the American competitor. And of course, there was a reluctance from the US because it was like technology like the EUV machine, which is now the most advanced technology available to produce these high-end AI chips. But it was then really in its infancy. And SVG was one of the license holders of this EUV technology. And the reason that ASML wanted to acquire the company was the fact that the US had kind of dropped the ball themselves on litho technology, which means, for example, for Intel, one of the customers of SVG, that they wanted ASML to take over SVG, so they could keep inventing and innovating their own chip manufacturing capacities. So they needed ASML to take over, which is an economic strategy. And it was, of course, the government was very worried about the national security aspect, but Intel, which is influential as well, was very worried about the economical consequences. So I think exchanging these ideas of, there's this concern about national security, but on the other end, there's economic reality. And I think that's the way ASML approaches these potential conflicts still up to this day. So they really try to explain and educate. Well, if you change something in the supply chain here, it will have effect on the other end. For example, in availability of chips for very common goods like dishwashers or microwaves. So it all has these consequences, and they're very good at explaining the value of this very brittle supply chain that is called the semiconductor industry.
So it's that particular acquisition was fascinating because back then there wasn't that kind of consideration in terms of how critical, right, semiconductor is.
Well, if I may interrupt you, I guess it's also like a sign of the times, because during the early 2000s, the world was really about globalization. So there was a huge flow of capital to every place. There was, well, there were no restrictions when it from a geopolitical point. So everything was like focusing on Asia, on Korea, on Taiwan mainly. And so that really helped ASML achieve this very tight bond with TSMC and also with Samsung, and to focus all the innovation and talent and capital on just various, just a few spots in the world. And now everything is, of course, about decoupling or replicating, and which means a lot of money is spent on just copying the system, which
which was, like I said, it's fascinating, right? It was, like you said, Intel's decision, right? Intel obviously at that time was such a dominant leader, but they decided that they didn't want this type of technology, or, for business reason, it's more cost effective for them to focus on something else. And so they almost wanted to just outsource that.
So are you referring to EUV or?
Yes, EUV, the SV. Is that right?
Let's start with explaining that EUV is like a technology. It's basically a kind of a light source that you need to print these very small, fine-grained lines on a silicon wafer. And EUV was developed in research labs around the world. So in Japan, Netherlands, and also in the US. And in the US, Intel picked it up like, well, this is going to be the technology the world's going to need, the semiconductor industry is going to need. So they invested a lot of money in it initially, but they weren't able to industrialize it. That's the phrase that I would like to stand out, because industrializing is a different kind of game than just developing something in a research lab. So ASMLs are particularly good at getting these complicated machines up and running for 24/7 every day in a year. So, and Intel couldn't accomplish that. So they were happy that ASML was willing to take on that risk. And they even invested in ASML to help them speed up the pace, because it took way longer than they expected. And the funny thing is that Intel, even though it had started up or booted up the EUV machine, it acquired these machines, but it was not very quick at adapting and using these machines in their fabs, because they were kind of risk averse compared to these competitors from China, from Asia, like TSMC and Samsung.
Well, so I mean, in some way, it helps ASML's monopoly status today. In my interpretation, it is kind of a tacit approval by the US government, by Intel. But today, fast forward, 20 something years later, do you think this kind of monopoly is to ASML's disadvantage or advantage, right? Business wise, of course, it's doing really well because the machines are just so rare, and everyone needs the machines. However, because only ASML has those machines, so it becomes almost like a target for all governments in particular, and of course businesses.
Well, apart from the monopoly advantage or not, I think the fact that the technology got this far, whether it's ASML or another company that it could have accomplished this, I think the result of having a EUV technology available is the fact that we have these incredible phones in our pockets now, and we have AI chips that are capable of doing the most unbelievable stuff. So in general, I think that's like a development we all should be very proud about. Well, in the case of ASML, having a monopoly is just a consequence of the fact that there was a huge capital investment and talent investment necessary to create a machine that's so complex. It has hundreds of thousands of parts. It has the most incredible technology, and they're still not very well. It's still not a perfect machine, even though the first machine was up and running in fabs in high volume, I think back in 2019. So that's 5 years ago. But they're still tweaking it, still trying to get the most yield and the highest throughput. So it's still a work in progress, which means this is a development that took like 2 decades. And there are not a lot of companies that can invest so much money and so much time and talent on just one machine.
Well, speaking of, obviously the machines have to be used. And I think in your book, you also talk about how Morris Chang from TSMC, was one of the first to order this EUV machine, and that was the right bet. So that's why you see that, TSMC can now manufacture as small as like 5 and 3 nanometers, and this can only be achieved through EUV machines. Now, 40% of ASML's business comes from TSMC. Does that kind of concentration worry ASML in today's environment?
Okay, well, let's first get back to your remark about Morris. I think he was kind of reluctant to buy EUV in first place because I think Samsung was the first one to sign the contract, and but TSMC, of course, is very good at creating great results with just the technology they really need. And when TSMC did buy the EUV machine, they really cooperated with ASML. Well, they created like a kind of a tight bond because these engineers really speak the same language, and their cultures mix in a way. Well, it's hard for an outsider to understand, but they speak of like the same Esperanto. So even if you're Dutch or Taiwanese, the engineers really understand each other because they have this common goal of getting this technology to work. And I think...
Why did you say Morris Chang ordered the machine unwillingly?
No, never unwillingly, of course. But I think it's about deciding the time when to switch to a new technology. It's really
I see.
It's a huge investment because the lithography machine is about 30% of any capital investment in a chip factory. So if you were to build a fab costing $10 billion, then 30% of it goes into the lithography system, which is, well, it's kind of a big deal. So getting back to this bond, I think the fact that ASML and TSMC are cooperating in such a great way is kind of the cause of this huge market share of TSMC. And you see this all pile up now in the system that everybody's craving for NVIDIA chips or AMD chips or even Intel's chips are being manufactured by TSMC. These very highly advanced cutting-edge AI chips. And the only reason they can build them is the fact that they have really these EUV machines and they have them under control and they're still tweaking them, which I think for ASML is like the proof that the most expensive machines, the lithography machines, the EUV machines, go to Taiwan and Samsung, which explains their huge market share.
Hmm. Well, and does that kind of concentration worry ASML in today's environment?
I think in general, you could say that you have to make sure that you're not depending on just a couple of customers, which is kind of hard in this market because it's so capital intensive that even a player like Intel is kind of losing in market share and now desperately trying to survive or find new ways for an Intel 2.0. So this market is so capital intensive that just a few players can keep up. Well, when it comes to ASML, their perspective on these matters are that as long as there's a demand, a global demand for chips, which is increasing and even doubling in the next couple of years, it doesn't matter if these chips are being manufactured just by one or two or three players. So it doesn't worry them as much. But of course, they live in the same world as you and I do. So they also understand the strategic benefits of de-risking. And just like TSMC is doing now, TSMC is building its fabs in Japan, in Dresden, in Germany, and of course in the US, which makes sense because you have to de-risk.
Yeah. Well, you talk about how it doesn't matter, whether it's one or more companies that are manufacturing chips because it's in such a high demand. So obviously ASML does business with China too. And China is a huge market. And so for the last few years, it's become challenging for ASML for sure. And the former CEO, Peter Wennink, I found him fascinating because he was probably the only one CEO that was most vocal questioning U.S. export control.
Can I explain or just make a small connection there with the topic we formerly addressed? Is the fact that ASML is like the monopolist. So every country wanting to build a more sovereign semiconductor industry is dependent on this one company, which is kind of a good place to be when you want to be more vocal. And if you compare ASML, for example, to the other US suppliers of semiconductor equipment, well, it's a Dutch company, and we have this Dutch culture of being very direct. But of course, we're not of ASML is not a company that is kind of feeling the pressure that US companies feel as well. So I guess that's one of the explanations why Peter Wennink, apart from his character, was more vocal than others.
However, I mean, while he was vocal, and I think probably a lot of even American counterparts appreciated his frankness. However, he still failed to convince entirely the U.S. government to impose those restrictions, and so there are consequences to ASML's business. And because of that, of course, the Dutch government got involved as well. And you had an interview, I think, with the Dutch Minister of Economic Affairs just a few days ago. And he said that Netherlands is seeking to build a coalition of European industrial nations to counterbalance the growing U.S. pressure to impose further restrictions on ASML's advanced chip-making equipment. And quote unquote, he said, "We don't need to be a pawn between superpowers." It's intriguing to me that he said it right now. And, because the Dutch did comply in the last few years. And why do you think that's the case?
Well, I don't think it's like a... Let me start by the reason I interviewed him was he's just new on the job, Minister Dirk Beljaard. So there was that was one of the reasons to interview, and also to hear his view on the fact that, the Netherlands feel a bit alone as a small country when it comes to all the diplomatic pressure that Washington applies to its allies, and especially the allies that have these lithography machines within their borders, which is just the Netherlands. And so they try to reach out to other EU nations and to say, well, help us explain that ASML is the most valuable technology company in Europe, and so it's an important company for every member state of the European Union. But somehow that the countries like Germany and France were not that interested in interfering in this thorny subject, as they mentioned it, as they called it. And now the Netherlands is doing this outreach to countries like Germany, France, Poland, Italy, and to find these industrialized countries and to create some kind of bond to be more firm in their response to the US pressure, because the Dutch do acknowledge there's a security risk in exporting lithography machines to countries like China, but they don't name China specifically. And they're also worried that interfering with this supply chain might cause troubles that are way worse. There's another fear, and that's within the Netherlands, that if you completely restrict the Chinese companies from using lithography machines, that's the best motivation to give to Chinese engineers to develop their own technology. Right. So it's really like, I guess you could compare to the Huawei effect, where Huawei was kind of pushed back, and you see they've now developed into a different kind of company that might be worse, so to speak, from a national security perspective.
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, the question is, will this help China produce another ASML, right? That is even more competitive.
Well, it's really hard to develop, engineer a lithography machine and to keep it running. That's what I explain in the book as well. It's not about the machine. It's also about the people running it, people keeping it alive. And so it really is a machine that needs to be corrected constantly and be serviced constantly, which is one of the chokeholds, of course, in this technology. But if you want to help the Chinese people develop their own technology, well, all you have to do is give them the economic opportunity, and which is the case if you totally restrict them from acquiring lithography machines from foreign countries.
So what do you think the future holds for not just ASML, but also just the global semiconductor supply chain?
Well, I'm careful to reach out and grab my crystal ball, because I'm not good at predicting the future. I'm glad I was able to, at least describe in a way in my book what's been going on for the last couple of 6 to 12 months, so I could predict the natural cause. But I think things might turn out way differently when there's a new US government or some other shift. God knows where there might be a new war somewhere around the globe, or another war might end, hopefully. So these things can shift, and what you see is that the semiconductor industry is really tied with with geopolitics and economics, and these how these will develop in the future. It's really not for me to say. I only know it will adapt.
So can I just poke a little bit deeper? Do you think the Netherlands will truly lead or in some way form a coalition that is more willing to stand up to the US pressure?
Okay, if you look at that from a general perspective, you see the tendency in Europe to also, in response to these superpowers fighting over them, China and US on one side, Europe is trying to develop its own industry, high-tech industry. And ASML is, of course, a huge part of that because, well, the company somehow has the capacity to create these complex machines and to keep them running and to build up a monopoly, which is something that Europe can use to build other industries as well. So, for example, the semiconductor industry based on technology from TSMC or maybe even Intel. But these semiconductors are needed to build up a car industry and to create V2X technology, to create an AI industry in Europe and be less dependent on the US and China.
Either the US or China. Yeah.
Which,
so it sounds like Europe also wants to be independent, or I should say less dependent.
Well, you could say that Europe is growing less naive by the day because being dependent on China or the US hasn't proven us well a very good deal until now.
Well, fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Mark, today for bringing us an important perspective from the Netherlands and more broadly Europe. I think in a way, Taiwan and the Netherlands share some resemblance, right? Both are small countries with very powerful export industries and, of course, leading semiconductor companies. Both countries are also democratic countries aligned with Western democratic bloc. So
yeah, I was just thinking maybe that's kind of the cultural fit that the employees at ASML also feel when they work in Taiwan. And
well, there's certainly that historic colonial history, that for sure. I think Chinese and Dutch, to a certain extent, right, have some affinity to each other. So, so how do I think the interesting thing about your book is, you know, how do those small countries, or to quote Peter Wenick, the Mickey Mouse countries, how do they navigate, survive, and even thrive in the new environment? It really requires, in my view, extraordinary wisdom, calmness, and confidence, right? And so I think there will surely be more developments in those restrictions or not in the semiconductor industry after the US presidential elections. And so we, you know, TVBS Meeting Room will continue to have more timely and insightful discussions, and we hope to have you back in the future. So take care.
Okay, thanks for having me. Bye-bye.